Tonight we're going to be talking about Purim, which is a very celebratory and happy celebration. And as we'll get to it, Purim, I spoke about this actually Yom Kippur when we had services outdoors in the tent. So I mentioned that people say that Yom Kippur is only the prelude to Purim, because in Hebrew, when you say Yom HaKippurim, and Purim in Kiv, when you add the kaf before a letter, it means it is like. So Yom Kippur is only like Purim, but Purim is the essence. And why? What's the connection? Is because while Purim, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, is a very somber day, Judaism believes that we could accomplish with unbridled joy is of the equivalent of what we could accomplish on the most somber day of the year, if not greater. So as we speak about Purim, hopefully the joy that we can create on Purim will be enough to, just like as we'll read, the story of Purim got turned upside down, where the decree to destroy the Jews became a positive, and it was turned upside down. Also, our life as we know it last year was turned upside down. Hopefully this year will turn right side up. With that said, today our focus is going to be about the story of Purim. And I'm sure some of you may be familiar with the story of Purim, some less familiar, but either way, we're going to focus tonight on a little bit of the story itself, just the basic run through, how we celebrate, and also why and the meaning behind the various customs and things that are associated with the holiday of Purim. And we'll also, I think we should have enough time here to discuss some customs or mitzvahs that we do that are associated with the time period of Purim, but not necessarily directly connected with the story of Purim itself. So to best understand the story of Purim, I think let's do this. Let's read, and if this is probably the most shortened version of the story of Purim. There's like Purim in a nutshell. So one of the customs of Purim is in the daily prayers, we add a Va'al Hanissim prayer, which commemorates the miracles that happened. And this is the summation of the story of Purim, the way it's brought in the prayer book. So Margina, if you could read for us this text.
In the days of Mordecai and Esther in Shushan, the capital, when Haman the wicked rose up against them and sought to destroy, to slay, and to exterminate all the Jews, young and old, infants and women, on the same day, on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. But you, in your abundant mercy, nullified his counsel and frustrated his intention, and caused his design to return upon his own head, and they hanged him and his sons on the gallows.
Okay, so this is, like I said, this is probably the most condensed version of this Purim story, and you have a one sentence things that happen years, months or sometimes years apart. So I want to break down the story in a little more detail. But before we do that, I think it's important to first off understand a little bit about the time frame when the story of Purim happened. And I think that it's always good to give perspective when we discuss the Purim story. So the story of Purim happened in between the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple. And what's a key part of the story, which may not be highlighted much, is that the first time the Jews were confronted with exile was in the time period of the story of Purim. From the time that the Jews became a nation until, about 60 years before the Purim story, the Jewish people always had a base, a homeland, and a structure which they were, a part of. There was the tabernacle in the desert. Moses was their leader. And they had that leadership, and they were traveling together as a community. And then they entered the land of Israel, and slowly they were building up. They were conquering the land, and eventually built the temple in Jerusalem. And the temple in Jerusalem was the epicenter of Judaism for the time period. And at the destruction of the first temple was the first time the Jews did not have, their own space. That was the first time that they were totally submissive since they became a nation at Mount Sinai, that their identity was challenged in a very serious way. And as a result, as we see many times, I'm not sure what terminology to put for this, fortunately, unfortunately, but when Jewish people come into a new land, a place where they're not sure if they're welcomed or not, many times, which is natural, people feel like they don't want to raise eyebrows, they want to figure out how to fit in, and so on and so forth. And this was a issue going on during the time of the story of Purim as well. There was a lot of different perspective, and there was a strong perspective of us not sticking out, becoming, assimilation, and so on and so forth was a challenge right away the Jews were dealing with the first time during this period of time of the Purim story, because this is the first time the Jewish people are on their own, sort of. They feel like they're on their own, and lost that structure. In this, within this system, ecosystem of the Jewish people and in Persia, there's one leader which proves to be the most staunch, supporter or believer in Jewish values, and that is Mordechai. And let me pull up here just the timetable, just to try to give a picture of what happened. So you have the destruction of the temple. And I think there's when I was looking online, there's some different opinions exactly what year happened when. I mean, not the years in between are the same, but this is according to the most standard or Rashi's understanding of the years. In the year 425 BCE is the destruction of the first temple. And Ahasuerus becomes king in the year 369. Now, during this time, previous kings had allowed already Jews to move back to Israel. And the foundation for the second temple was already set. And we know from the writings of the prophets that were involved in that first migration back to Israel, is that they're already dealing with issues of assimilation and Jewish identity within the people coming back with them. And the Ahasuerus ascends to the throne, and one of the first things that he does is he stops the construction for the second temple, and he blocks any continuation of what's going on. So if anyone's reading between the lines, you already know that Ahasuerus is not exactly the most Jewish-friendly individual. He throws a feast in the year 366 BCE. Now, we know this feast as a celebration of his power. If you read the Torah, if you read the Megillah, the extent of the reign of Ahasuerus was probably one of the largest of any king of the time. He ruled over 120 countries, which traditionally in Judaism we say is pretty much most of the known civilization at the time. And he had a vast empire with many kings and countries subservient to him. And he's throwing a feast where he's basically, celebrating his might and his glory. And he throws a feast for 180 days. And in this feast, he invites people from all provinces of the land. They all come and so on and so forth. Now, there are details that are in the basic story of Purim which are missing here, which put a lot of contents into why the story of the feast is mentioned in the Megillah, aside for the story of what's it called, of Vashti and Esther that come as a result of it. And the first thing is that there's a hidden message in why Ahasuerus threw this feast. If anyone's familiar with Nebuchadnezzar from the scriptures, he was a king that was earlier with Prophet Daniel and the writing in the wall. Any of that story ring a bell with anybody? Anyways, Nebuchadnezzar was Ahasuerus' predecessor. And Nebuchadnezzar also threw a big feast, which ended up in disaster and the collapse of his kingdom. And the reason why that king prior threw the feast, and the reason why Achashverosh threw the feast, was for the same reason. There was prophecies from the Jewish prophets that the Jewish people would be 70 years in exile after the destruction of the first temple, and then they will enter the land of Israel and rebuild the second temple. Now, when do you start counting those 70 years? There's there's the Jewish tradition, and then there was the misconception of the kings at the time. Some of the kings at the time thought it was when the armies began to lay siege, or when the first group of slaves were taken out of Israel, and that's where they counted their 70 years. So his predecessor counted from when the first group of slaves went out. And when he says 70 years later, the Jews aren't going back, that means our empire is going to stay forever and the Jews are going to remain slaves forever, and he threw his feast. Achashverosh made the count based off when the siege began. And again, so he here at this celebration, he's celebrating in his mind what he sees as the ultimate, the testament that he's blocked the construction of the second temple. And the 70 years have passed and he's still in power and the Jews haven't regained their power. And so he's celebrating in his false security that he's going to be safe and secure and the Jews are never going to leave his control. As a result, he had what we would call the chutzpah, or the audacity, to actually freely use the items of the temple that were captured or were taken during the capture of the first temple. So the tradition says that he dressed up in the high priest's garments during this party, and that they were using the goblets and the bowls that were from the temple. They were using it for serving and for partying. And he was brazenly displaying, the mastery, sort of say, of the Persian Empire over Judea. With that said, Achashverosh was also the superpower at the time. And when he threw the feast, in some ways, similarly like Iran, which is modern day Persia, does today, says is that their issue is only with Israel, not with the Jewish people. And when he threw his feast, he threw a party and invited the Jews to attend. Not only did he invite the Jews to attend, he made sure that there was kosher supervision for the food, and everything was up to that. No one should have an excuse not to be able to attend. The food would be on, high par and everything. And the Midrash tells us that Mordechai, understanding who Achashverosh was adamant that Jews should not attend this feast. And despite his call, let's just say that the feast was very well attended. So according to some tradition, this testament that the Jews were ready to ignore some red flags about their own values and future and attend this feast was already a sign that there was something negative was going to happen. History was not heading in a good direction for the future of the Jewish people at this point. Now, we know, let's go back to the timeline. Let's go back to any questions what we said so far, or did I make sense? Good? All right.
Yeah.
So the feast happened in the year 366. Now we know that the feast ended with a 7-day celebration, which the king invited all the residents of Shushan. So the rest of the world was disinvited. Now everyone went back, but he still and he had, I think, the heads of state from many of the countries, and the citizens of Shushan were invited. And it was on the 7th day of this feast, which was traditionally on Shabbat, when Achashverosh summons Queen Vashti. Now, Queen Vashti, there's a lot of articles written about her today, modernizing trying to get perspective of Vashti, whatnot. But I can tell you what the Jewish perspective of Vashti was. Vashti, in Jewish tradition, and what's specific about this happening on Shabbos, she took she would take groups of Jewish girls that would be her workers, and she would treat them like slaves. And specifically on Shabbat, when she knew that they had tradition to keep Shabbat, she made sure that they were working and doing everything to desecrate their Shabbat. This was the Vashti that we know of, and her father was actually Nebuchadnezzar, who spearheaded the destruction of the first temple. So she was the daughter of the previous king. Achashverosh didn't have royal blood of his own. He actually married into royalty. To note, the name Achashverosh traditionally is from the fact of Ach Rosh. My head is hurting. Ach Rosh. He was quite a personality. I'm not going to compare him to other political figures that we may know, but to say the least, he used to, whatever he would do would get people nervous and give heartache. That's where the name comes from, or at least that's a tradition that given to the name. Yes, Margina.
Yes, I found in something I'm reading that in Greek his name was Xerxes, which we've studied in school, and I never realized until now that Ahasuerus was Xerxes. So
interesting.
interesting.
I didn't know that offhand either.
I just learned that.
So where are we here? All right, so we have the feast that lasts 180 days. So she summons Vashti, and Vashti, according to tradition, was very excited to appear in Achashverosh's presence and to be able to show off her beauty and show off her majestic presence and so on and so forth. And it says that according to tradition, a miracle happened and she grew pimples right when she was called. So then, to avoid her from attending, and of course not to say that she's looking ugly, she lambasted the guards that came to collect her, and basically said that you're only you're no better than a stableman, which you come from, and I come from nobility, and who are you to tell me what to do? And to say the least, the king wasn't very happy to hear that from his wife, especially a guy like Achashverosh. And being also the incompetent person that he was, he didn't even know how to deal with his own marital issues. And he summons, and the Megillah tells us, he summons his advisors on how to deal with his rebellious wife. And the Megillah, the book of Esther, says that, I think it was, I don't have the book in front of me, but it says that one of the advisors, Vayemer Mumuchan said before the king, and tradition says this was actually Haman who gave this advice. That gave the advice to have Vashti killed. Why did Haman give this advice? Because believe it or not, even back then people were power hungry, and Haman was not yet second in command, and he was hoping to get his daughter to become the next queen, and then him having more influence in the palace. This was a good, typical, traditional monarchy story of someone taking advantage, and I think you have this within the English Empire, where some of the kings, which they beheaded or got rid of their wives, and people were at their side, were being opportunistic to hopefully get someone that's more in line with their ideals and to be able to pursue their own personal political or powerful power interests. And this is similar here. And Achashverosh, being the wise man that he was, saw that he's having some marital issues, so he figured everybody in the world must have issues at home. So not only does he have his wife killed, Vashti killed, he also sends out a decree that the man has to be the head of the house, and and he's imposing the issues that he's having, where he can't he can't figure out how to have a conversation with his wife, so he's imposing his insecurities on the whole nation. And people got this, and this is part of where he got the name. When people got decrees like this, they're like, Achresh, what's this guy's issue? But that sets the tone, a lot of us identifying the characters. Now, with Vashti's absence, there needs to be a new queen. So Haman wasn't the one present when this idea was given. Otherwise, he would have just come and proposed his daughter straight up. And the idea is given of the first real beauty pageant, I guess. And they try bringing all the single women of the whole throughout the King Ahasuerus empire for him to choose a queen. So about, you can see over here, it was about 4 years of this search until Esther was taken. And part of this, even though Esther was in Shushan, Esther was no interest. You can imagine a good Jewish girl had no interest in becoming the queen of Persia or being married to Ahasuerus. So she would do whatever she could to avoid the scouts that were in the streets. But to her, to obviously destiny was meant to be, and she was spotted at one point, and she was brought to the king's palace. And you can see, even the way the Megillah describes it, all the other girls were there, which were there on their own, out of their own will and interest. They spent all the time they needed putting on makeup and preparing themselves. And Esther does the bare minimum. Whatever she's told she has to do, she does. And more than that, she did not put in any effort. And sure, she shows up and she's chosen. She's chosen to be queen. So now she's the queen. Now, it said, I'm not sure exactly when this happened, but sometime after, while she was queen, and she solicited Mordecai to have more of a presence in the palace, even though she didn't reveal her identity of who she was. Mordecai overhears a plot to assassinate the king, and Esther tells the king about it in the name of Mordecai, and Mordecai's heroic actions get written into a book of Chronicles. Now, about 5 years later is when Haman rises to power. And Haman being in power is not enough. He needs everyone to show their submissiveness to him. And so he goes around saying everyone needs to bow down to him when he walks around. Now, there's 2 issues with prostrating oneself before in Judaism. One is that we only bow down or posture before God. Now, if a person is acting in behalf of, in God's stead, there is a concept of bowing, at least half bowing in front of a king. But Haman also will carry an idol around his neck. So bowing to Haman would also be recognizing the idol that he was wearing. Now, traditionally, there's also, interestingly, a whole history between Haman and Mordecai. Apparently, Haman and Mordecai were both involved in overseeing the military in one of the Persian battles. And Mordecai was very good at what he was doing. Haman was not. And Haman had actually signed himself as a slave to Mordecai in order to get provisions to be able to take care of the people under his command. And while it wasn't a contract which Mordecai was planning on using, but during this story, it said that they didn't have paper, so Haman had written it on Mordecai's shoe. So at any time, not only did Mordecai not bow, but when every time Haman would walk by, Mordecai would actually pick up his shoe and wave it in Haman's face. So to say the least, they weren't best of friends. And Mordecai, being a very proud Jew, was not going to budge on his morals for a vindictive person like Haman. Haman then decides that he has to destroy the Jewish people, and he casts the lots about 5 years after Esther's in the palace. He throws the lots, and sometime in the month of Nisan, which we're not sure exactly what day, a few days late, we know on the 13th day of Adar is when the first decrees get dispatched to. They were supposed to be secretively only sent to the heads of state to start planning and prepping for the destruction of the Jews. This was something the Jews were not supposed to know about until a year later. Mordecai, being around the palace, finds out, gets a copy of these decrees, sends it to Esther, and Esther asked that everyone should fast for 3 days, and then she'll go to the king's palace. What's interesting, if you notice here, the days 14th, 15th, and 16th days of Nisan. Anyone know what days those are on the Jewish calendar? The 15th day of Nisan or the 16th day? So we're right now in the month of Adar. Next month is Nisan. What festivals in the next month?
The fast
Passover. Passover.
Oh, okay.
Right after Purim is Passover, and Passover is on the 15th to 16th day of Nisan. So because this was probably one of the first times the Jews did not have a Seder, was during the story of Purim. And it's not in the scripture, but there was some apprehension from Mordechai of doing the fast because it was rolling into a holiday. But because of the severity of the situation, it was kind of like rather fast one Passover so that we can celebrate next year Passover together. So she fasts for 3 days, and she goes into the king's presence, and she asks the king to come join a meal that she's prepared, her and Haman. They come, and she doesn't feel it's the right time to say anything, so she invites them the next day. That night, the king's sleeping, he can't sleep. They bring out the book of Chronicles, and for whatever reason, they read the story of Mordechai. And the king realizes Mordechai was never repaid. And so he's thinking of how he could repay Mordechai. That same night, a few blocks away, Haman decides he can't wait to next year to destroy the Jews. He needs to get rid of Mordechai right now. So he builds a gallows 50 cubits high, and he's on his way over to the king's palace in the middle of the night to get the king's permission to hang Mordechai. He shows up at the palace the same time the king's trying to figure out how to reward Mordechai. And he turns to him and says, what should be done to the man that the king wishes to honor? And he says, well, he's thinking, who would the king want to honor more than me? So he has grandiose ideas of being the next king. So he says, let him be dressed in the king's garments, rode on the king's horses, march through the cities, be treated like a king. And the king says, great, now do all that to Mordechai the Jew. And Haman right here sees, he starts seeing hell open up in front of him. But the king says, and he has to do it. And the next day, begrudgingly, he carries Mordechai through the streets. And after being totally downtrodden and devastated and spirit destroyed, he gets summoned to the second party. And at this second party, Esther already sees that Haman is not having a good day and says it's time to, add the icing on the cake, and says that she tells the king that she's Jewish, and she intercedes on behalf of the Jewish people. And she points to the gallows. Today we just celebrated Mordechai. This guy Haman was planning on hanging Mordechai in those gallows. So Haman gets sent right away. The king has orders that Haman be hung on those gallows. Now, so that was, we had the 14th, 15th, 16th. On the 17th day of Nisan, the middle of Pesach, is actually when Haman was killed. Now, the thing with decrees of kings is that once a decree is made, at least in the land of Persia, can't be rescinded. It's not like we have in Congress, which you can vote and appeal or amend. Once something is set and signed at the king's signet ring, it can't be repealed. So the date for the Jewish destruction of the Jewish people was set for next year. So after the dust settles and Haman's out of the picture, about 2 months later, through diplomacy, Mordechai and Esther convince Achashverosh to send out a decree to allow the Jewish people to self-defense. So the decree was never rescindicated. The Jewish people were allowed to defend themselves. And as a result, too, the king also threw his support behind the Jewish people, and local governments also, once Mordechai came to power. So the Jewish people weren't fighting alone either. But the next year, and basically all the anti-Semites who wanted had the ability to try to kill the Jewish people. And unfortunately, people did. And the next year, the 13th of Adar, the Jewish people were able to muster up a defense and basically stop anyone who was trying to attack them in their communities. And the king also had Haman's kids were kind of leading those people trying to antagonize the Jews. They were killed in battle, and the king Achashverosh ordered that they be hung separately. This has nothing to do with the gallows their father was hung on. After they were killed, they should be hung as a statement, an example of what their actions were. And so this was on the 13th of Adar. In the city of Shushan, the capital city, for whatever reason over there, I guess was maybe because it was the capital, more people amassed there. The situation did not subside just in the 13th of Adar, but it continued into the 14th, the next day. And therefore, sorry, where are we here? Sorry, I'm mixing up. On the 13th of Adar, Haman's kids were executed. On the 14th, so yeah. And then the 14th day of Adar, in Shushan, they were still fighting. So what happened is on the 14th of Adar, the battles were ended everywhere else. So everyone else was celebrating the miracle, the fact that they were saved. And on the people, the city of Shushan only were able to celebrate on the 15th of Adar once everything had subsided. Over the next year of 3406 or 355 BCE is when the Megillah was written and the festivities of Purim were established. So that is a more detailed breakdown of the story of Purim. One thing that's interesting, just to note, we read from the in the beginning, Margina read from the Alanissim prayer. It says how God thwarted the plans. What's interesting is if you look in the book of Esther, the name of God is not mentioned anywhere. And in my brief run through of the story, we mentioned that the Jewish people fasted and they prayed, but the story itself has a very beautiful, novel sense to it, where you had all the pieces were put in place and kind of fate played itself out. We don't see any miracle the extent of the splitting of the sea or the like in the story of Purim. And this is a very integral part of the Purim story. And one of the reasons why it's called Megillas Esther is because Esther is a name which Mordechai gave his cousin, when she was taken to the palace. Esther means hidden. And as we'll see, we go through the customs of Purim, a lot of it is about concealment. And the story of Purim is at a time of destitute, at a time of exile, like we mentioned in the beginning of the story. The Jewish people were on their own, or felt like they were on their own. They did not have the presence of God present as they had in the times of the temple. And they were under a situation which it seemed unsurmountable. But yet, things fall into place, and God doesn't have to work miracles in order for his will to come in place. And this is what the story of Esther tells us, that God could remain hidden and yet still be, moving the pawns and putting everything in place for each and every person's salvation. And this is one of the big elements which, when we realize this, the celebration is beyond. It's easy to celebrate when we see great miracles. We don't have to doubt God's presence. It's very easy to doubt, and we're going through a rut, and we don't see the way out. It's very hard to celebrate or recognize God's presence. But the story of Purim is a reminder, no matter where we are, no matter the circumstances, and we may not see a great miracle, but that doesn't mean that God isn't right beside us. And when we can recognize that, that's a joy that we can carry anytime and any place. And that's why also when we celebrate Purim, the joy, we have this element, as we'll discuss, where we don't hold back, because there's nothing to hold back from. It's a joy which we can carry at any moment and any time. Any questions before we? So this is the story of Purim itself. Now we'll go on to how traditionally the holiday of Purim is celebrated. Norma, if you could read for us. This is actually the book of Esther. Just unmute before. You able to get it? Here, we'll go to Cheryl. We'll come back for you for the next reading.
Sorry.
Cheryl, go ahead.
Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent dispatches to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, charging them to observe the 14th and 15th day of Adar every year. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, and as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. The Jews accordingly assumed as an obligation that which they had begun to practice and which Mordecai prescribed for them.
Okay. Yvonne, if you could read this next text.
Consequently, consequently, these days are recalled and observed in every generation by every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim shall never cease among the Jews, and the memory of them shall never perish among their descendants.
Okay, so there's a few things about the celebration of Purim here which I want to mention. The first thing is over here we mentioned that we celebrate Purim on the 14th and the 15th day of Adar. So with this, most holidays and most traditions, when the rabbis established the holiday, because this is not a biblical holiday, this is established after the destruction of the first temple, after Moses' times. They try doing it in a way which it's seamless amongst everybody, right? We all celebrate. In the Torah, we have one day of Rosh Hashanah, and that's celebrated by everybody. Now, some people celebrate two, and again, we draw a clear line. We try limiting the differences as much as possible. But we're all really trying to, I'm not going to get into the 2 days of other holidays. Purim is the one time in which there's a different day designated for the celebration. For anyone who's out, and for most people, they celebrate Purim on the 14th day of Adar, which this year is on Thursday night, Friday. Now, if you remember in the story, the people of Shushan only celebrated a day later because they had an extra day of fighting. So the people in Shushan, their Purim was in theory a day later. So whoever's in the city of Shushan, which wherever that is in Iran today, they celebrate they don't celebrate Purim on the 14th, they celebrate on the 15th. Now, because this story is I think this is probably the only Jewish holiday which marks a miracle that did not happen in the land of Israel. And we give the land of Israel a lot of prestige in our celebrations. So in order to give some prestige to the land of Israel in the celebrations, a very interesting idea, and I don't know that I fully can give you all the ideas behind it, but I can just tell you the fact, is in order to make Israel unique and remembered in the celebration of Purim, the rabbi said any walled city within the borders of Israel, walled city at the time of the Jews entering the building of the second temple, any city which was walled then and the surrounding areas, they celebrate with Shushan on the 15th day of Adar. So if you're ever in Israel celebrating Purim, it could be very confusing if you don't know this concept, because you can have one city that celebrates on the 14th and another city which is celebrating on the 15th. And you got to know where you are. And if you want to hear the Megillah being read on the 14th, if you're in the city, for example, if you're in Jerusalem, you're not going to be able to find a Megillah reading because they celebrate on the 15th. And when we were in Israel, if you want, you could celebrate both days of Purim. You could move to one city for the first day and move to this next city the next day. And it's a whole lot of fun. This year, though, we the same day as Israel. You know why? Because the 15th falls out on Shabbat. And on Shabbat, we don't add any of the special customs of Purim because some of it includes carrying gifts to other friends, and we don't carry on Shabbat, and so on and so forth. So therefore, we read the Megillah on Friday. Everyone in Israel whoever celebrates on the 15th this year does the Megillah reading on Friday with everybody else. And then on Sunday is when they'll do the gifts and the charity and all the other traditions that we'll speak about in a second. So actually, this year is a very interesting year. And if I remember correctly, when we were in Israel, it fell out on the, no, it didn't fall out like this. It actually fell out. It was Thursday, Friday, Shabbat. So it was like 3 days going in. So what are the there's four mitzvahs which we know for Purim. The first one, I'll go from this text, is recalling the story of Purim and making sure it's remembered. How to recall the story of Purim? So by hearing the Megillah reading, and that's where we traditionally read the Megillah. And it says that they sent the story of Purim to everybody. So therefore, you'll notice we don't bring out a Torah-style looking scroll and read the Megillah. We bring out a single scroll. It should look like a letter that was sent in the mail. So it's something that's very easily portable to remember the way Mordechai sent it out then. And we read it, and the first and foremost mitzvah of Purim is to hear the Megillah reading. And there's a mitzvah to hear it both by night, Thursday night this year, and Friday morning, and by day. So in synagogue, they read it both Thursday and Friday. So that's the first big mitzvah. And actually, traditionally on a holiday, we sing Hallel or other verses of praise. We don't do that on Purim because the Megillah reading is our way of celebrating and singing the praise of the miracle. We don't need to do more than that. The next thing, so the next things I highlighted here is days of feasting and merrymaking. So it's customary to have a festive meal and be merry. We say l'chaim on Purim, for those which can say l'chaims. And we send gifts to one another and presents to the poor, right? So we see this very big theme of unity and sharing and giving on Purim. So first thing is you cannot have a true joy if you're not sharing. That's an idea that Judaism has. And this is why even on a regular holiday, we're told to invite people which don't have means to join our meals, or at least give them provisions that they can have, because you can't really be happy if you're being stingy about it. You have to be generous. You have to be looking out for another. When we look out for others, then we're happy. So when it comes to the laws of Purim, there's a mitzvah to give charity to 2 poor people, but a gift, you fulfill your mitzvah by giving it to only one other friend. So the stress is more on the charity than it is on the gift. However, sometimes we can lose sight of that, because where can you put more bows and ribbons? On a gift. When you give money to a poor person, there's no real bow and ribbon. It's not as glorious. You don't find the theme or stuff like that. So some people at times get very carried away in their gifts, but it's important to remember that more important than the gifts is to give charity for others on Purim. So so we give charity, and then the idea of the gift, the meal, is also okay. Good question. So let me explain this a bit. So the first thing is to give charity. You want to give charity or provisions to a poor person on Purim. To the extent that it's known and within tradition, on Purim, anybody who extends their hand, we give. It's a day of giving, and therefore anyone who's in need, it's an opportune time to give. The meal, the gifts of friends, is not necessarily giving to someone who doesn't have. Right? And this is a concept of allowing ourselves to be humble, to take and to give. And that giving is not exclusive to people which are in dire situations, but even within our own friendships and relationships, the only way we really grow is when we allow to take and we allow ourselves to give. So when it comes to gifts, we're all sitting down to meals. The idea is to have prepared food. You're sort of participating in their celebration meal by sending over some food. So the custom is to send over 2 prepared foods. It doesn't have to be of 2 different species. You could send over 2 cookies. You could the idea is though 2 prepared foods that you send over and share with someone else. There was, I was reading recently a worksheet that was prepared for like kids in school, and they do every week, they bring an interesting case and ask if what would the rabbi's decision be on this? So the question was, if someone basically gives someone a cow on Purim, is the milk in the cow considered ready to eat food? And can it be considered part of Shalach Manas? I thought that was quite a funny case scenario. It was based off a story that happened where basically someone was trying to bribe the rabbi, so he gifted a cow on Purim, and 3 weeks later came and asked for a favor, and the rabbi's like, "Oh, that's why you gave me the cow. Take the cow back." So the so the question was, would the guy even do the mitzvah of shalach manas? A cow is it was a funny story, but either way, the you're sending prepared foods, and the idea behind that is that we're sharing in each other's celebration. And this goes into the unity element that Purim is about celebrating with others, and the fact that as a nation we were saved. And we do that, and the reason why we're usually saved, or way we have the ability to do that, is when we unify with one another, when we're looking out for one another, and we don't forget about each other. So that's where we have in the celebration, the giving to charity and giving meals to others. For those which may be familiar, on Purim, there's a concept in the Talmud which says one should drink to the extent which they don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. And the idea behind this goes into what I was saying before, is that what we're celebrating on Purim is a joy which is beyond everything else, where the presence of Haman and Mordechai are irrelevant. When we come to realize that God is with us at any point given time, so no matter who's the powers to be at the time, whoever the characters right now in my life is, I know that God is walking along me. And therefore, at the end of the day, whether it was Haman in charge, Mordechai in charge, God was with us throughout it all. And that's why when we celebrate, we don't make it's an unbridled, it's an unlimited joy, sort of say. And there's many stories in the Talmud which all connect to this idea. But this is the four main mitzvot on Purim. Did I answer the question? All right. So the other just over here, some of the other customs which are associated with Purim is dressing up. Now, this is not anywhere in the book of Esther. So it's not one of the things which Mordechai said, Andy, you should dress up. But as we mentioned, part of the idea of Purim is the fact that Esther had concealed her true identity, and also that God's presence was hidden. So a nice way to get the kids excited, and today even the adults excited about Purim, is by doing dress up. But the idea behind it is solely about to commemorate the hidden identity of that Esther played, and also the fact that God's presence is hidden within the story. In connection with that, we have Hamantashen. Now, Hamantashen is a conception that the shape of the Hamantash has something to do with Haman. So I have yet to find any proven factor for it. It helps, though, when we make Purim plays, people associate the pirate three-triangled hat with Haman. So we could wear that hat and people know who the character is. But we don't know there's no documented anywhere that Haman's hat was triangle, or that his ears were triangle, or anything of that sort that Haman has to do with triangle. So where does Hamantashen or Haman have to do with this baked good? So I'll tell you like this. Historically, the Hamantash is made with poppy seeds. Why poppy seeds? Because Esther and Chagai, her right-hand assistant, was also Jewish. When they were in the king's palace, they did not want to eat anything not kosher, so they resorted to eating seeds and the bare minimum while they were in the palace. And therefore, we eat a food that's filled with poppy seeds to remind us of the minimal, or the seeds that Esther ate and to survive while being in the king's palace. That's the first tradition where we know about this poppy seeds, or about the Hamantash, where it came from. Why then is it called Hamantash? Because man is seeds in Hebrew. And we call it the mantash, is really the original word. Now, some people have done a play on words, that when you say man, you add a little twist, it sounds like Haman. So a seed-filled pastry, right? A seed-filled pastry is just like we make noise in the synagogue when we say Haman's name, we blot it out. So eating man tash is kind of like eating Haman, right? You're just, it's part of our it's a good, not diet friendly way of eradicating Haman's presence. Haman's presence. Another idea behind the Hamantash is that a lot of the Hamantash, really you're supposed to have the filling covered up. So you have the filling on the hidden in the inside, signifying as well the concealment that there was during the time of Esther. On the outside, it looked like a rough crust, but really on the inside, God was present. There was the sweetness that was always lingering right underneath the surface. That's part of the Hamantash. Similarly, is anyone familiar with kreplach? Anyone ever had kreplach? So there's a tradition to eat kreplach on Purim as well. For that same reason, kreplach are kind of like a Chinese dough that has like chicken or meat or whatever, or vegetable, whatever inside that you put in a soup. And it's similar where the kish, the good part of the food is hidden within a wrap as well, showing on the concealment that there's something good hidden within the wrap. So there's a tradition of the same way we could eat hamantash. If you want a more fancier way, you could eat kreplach. And you could say that you're having your hamantash that way. So those are the three things. There's other things which are associated around the time of Purim. There's a special prayers, like I mentioned, the Al Nissim prayer, which we add in the daily prayer on Purim. There's a special Torah reading, which we read. So it's not necessarily a mitzvah of Purim, but we read it around Purim time because the story of Purim kind of has this connection. If anyone's familiar with the story of King Saul and Amalek, which was the Amalekim at the time, where King Saul was told to destroy the descendants of Amalek, and he failed to do that entirely. We're told that Haman was a descendant of Amalek. So the story of Purim was almost a rehash of the battle of Amalek and the Jews way back before the building of the first temple. When the Jews were on their way out, were getting themselves established in the land of Israel. And there's a mitzvah in the Torah that we should remember every year, the story of Amalek. So in the Torah portion of the Shabbat prior to the holiday of Purim, so last week, in the synagogue, we do a special reading where we read the story of Amalek. And then on Purim itself, the Torah reading, which we read in synagogue, a special reading for the holiday of Purim, is also the story of the remembrance of Amalek. So it's a special mitzvah as well to hear that. It's one time a year. It's fulfilling the obligation to remember the story of Amalek. When the Jewish people were leaving the land of Egypt, how Amalek came to wage war against them while they were in the desert, the only nation that had the guts to do that. Another thing which we do around Purim, if you go to synagogue, or interesting to do, is called the half shekel coin. So traditionally around the time in the last month of the year, which Adar in the Hebrew calendar is the last month of the year, there was a communal, in the times of the temple, there would be a communal collection where everyone would give the value of a half shekel coin. And that would go to the temple, and that's how they would bring communal sacrifices, or they do communal services. So how is it considered communal? Because everyone contributed a half shekel, and it was with that money that they bought whatever they needed for the communal services and sacrifices. So that way every person actually had a participation in the communal service and sacrifices. So this was done every year in the month of Adar. So to remember that annual collection, there's a tradition to give to charity during the month of Adar the equivalent of what a half shekel coin would be worth. Or we do the equivalent of, we do today, I think traditionally it's like $1.50. And what we do in the synagogue, what they do is, in order to, you're supposed to give it in the means of half coins, right? Which in modern currency is $50. So you're supposed to give it in a coin that's considered a half of whatever the common currency is then. So in the synagogue, if you're lucky, they'll actually have silver $50 coins, and you'll put 150 in the collection box, and you'll acquire the 150, those 3 half coins, and then you'll give it back for someone else to acquire to do that 150. So sort of say you're giving in with those the half coin dollars. So this is all a little bit about the traditions of C. I didn't even notice the time, but we're running right on 8 o'clock already. So I feel like I've spoken enough. So this is a brief, I just kidding, a nice recap of the story of Purim. Some of the traditions, there's so much that dive into the story itself, different elements of the story and the Megillah, but that's for another time. Yes. Margina, go ahead.
Unmute. I would like to do a little bit of show and tell if I could. I've been looking at a book called The Five Megillot and Jonah. And if you can see that, it's an old book. And I was looking through it. It was my husband's book. And it turns out it was his son's book, because I was looking at the beginning and it says, if you can, I'll read it. It says, presented to Avraham ben Gershon, Alan Ward Kaplan, that's George's son, on the occasion of his confirmation on May 27th, 1974, Shavuot 6 Sivan 50.